I want to continue on with the pace of talking about artists, albums, or styles of music that's rarely talked about, if at all, here on YouTube. And I think the next perfect contender for a video would be dark ambient music. If you're wondering what dark ambient music is, and how does it differ from regular ambient music, well, to be upfront with you from the start, there really isn't that many differences between the two other than just sound textures and the overall vibe that they give off. You see, both styles of music are extremely minimalistic, and both styles of music heavily rely on that of the usage of a synthesizer when creating the sounds, textures, atmosphere, and ambience that makes these styles of music what they are. But as I stated a second ago, there are some noticeable differences between the two, even though they follow the same song structure, that being basically everything that's against the regular song structure in the traditional sense of music, as they don't have any melodies or hooks or any rhythm sections, and really all they're creating is just a backdrop when it comes to the songwriting approach of just, again, atmosphere and ambience. The differences between the two, however, is when you talk about ambient music, it's a lot more welcoming and comforting, in the sense that how vibrant and blissful that it sounds, it almost feels as if I found the stairway to heaven and I'm going up it when I listen to ambient music. Where dark ambient music, even though it follows the exact same formula with its song structure, is the complete total opposite of that in terms of the overall vibe. It sounds a lot more isolated, cacophonous, gloomy, and just has this overarching sense of dread no matter what you hear in this style of music. As for the origins of dark ambient music, it's really quite fascinating just how far back it stretches in the timeline, because technically you can say ambient and dark ambient music has been around since the creation of the first ever developed synthesizer all the way back in 1955, created by both Harry Olson and Herbert Beller. However, this is the first electronic sound synthesizer. If you want to trace it back even further to what is technically the first ever synthesizer, that would be the Novacord. And this was a polyphonic synthesizer, which is the idea of combining two or more notes or chords together to create a different sound, a different chord, a different note. You get the idea. And this was manufactured between the years of 1939 to 1942, and it's estimated that roughly only 1,000 are in existence. And I think a huge reason as to why, when you look at the history of ambient, or in this case dark ambient music, is that it doesn't go back this far as well because of the limited quantities. It wasn't really that readily available to the public or musicians to experiment and play around with. Thus, you won't really find any history between the Novacord and ambient music at any point. But where dark ambient music is often credited for stemming from would be in the 1960s. This would be the same time period when the Moog synthesizer was manufactured, which is quite significant when you consider the fact that it's often credited as one of the very first synthesizers commercially available to the public. Now the question remains, what was the first ever band or artist to create dark ambient music? What's the earliest example you could hear of this style of music being played? What I find really interesting learning about the history of dark ambient music is, while technically it's been played from the 1970s and even the 1980s, kind of unintentionally, so to say, and it wouldn't be its own genre, having its own term coined up until the 1990s, which I'll get to that later on in this video. What's often credited for being the first true example of dark ambient music would come from a German krautrock band, Popol Vuh, with their album Affenstunde, released back in 1970. And for its time, it really didn't find any mainstream appeal. However, critics often cite it and regard it in high praise for creating the spacey, ominous, and droning sound that would become dark ambient music for today's standards. And I would say even for the modern audience like myself, people will find fascination with it solely because when you connect it to the history of dark ambient music, this is like basically the start position of this style of music. What I also find really interesting about this album is that if you had a physical copy and you look at the other end of the vinyl jacket, you can see the band members playing. And one of them's playing on the Moog synthesizer that I talked about a minute ago. While I can't say with confidence that Popova opened up the floodgates for, musicians down the road to start experimenting with dark ambient music, although I will say maybe they started opening up the minds of the local musicians around Germany with their krautrock scene during the time, I will say I think what started opening up the floodgates for more experimentation and boundaries being pushed with this style of music was just overall the accessibility of the Moog synthesizer to the public and other brands and models coming forth through the coming years. I will say, however, during the 1970s, this was a time period where music really didn't have any rule books to follow. There wasn't any niche little subgenres that people were trying to box themselves in. And I really do feel like this was the decade for music where experimentation was almost kind of like the norm. And again, as I stated, during this time, even though dark ambient really didn't have its own, scene or its own genre tag, it seemed like people were making it by accident almost, in a sense, even if they had a sense of direction. An early example of dark ambient music, believe it or not, comes from a movie soundtrack for the film done by David Lynch, Eraserhead, which has this very droney and incredibly eerie sound being played throughout its whole runtime that perfectly matches up with the tone of the film to begin with, of that surrealist and otherworldly like setting that the film is going for. That again, if you want another early example of I would even call it proto dark ambient music, definitely check out the soundtrack for Eraserhead. And if you just want a wild trip of surrealism that's a nightmare basically, definitely check out the film as well for Eraserhead. But what I do believe is the scene and sound that got the floodgates opening for more experimentation that would be adjacent or incredibly similar to what dark ambient is for today's standards would be the whole industrial boom music scene that was happening during the late 70s to early 80s. Some obvious noteworthy names would be Throbbing Gristle, Einster, Zen de Neubauten, Nocturnal Admissions, SPK, Nurse with Wound, and I'd even include early Current 93 material, just to name a few. It's vital to bring up the industrial scene during this time because it really got the ball rolling for new ideas to come, as industrial music was just born out of experimentation with every release that was being pumped out during the late 70s and early 80s. Thus, it created new ideas, new experimentations, and more importantly, new sounds and textures that could be implemented with music. Since industrial is an umbrella term that covers a broad array of different styles of music out there, it becomes extremely fluid as to what exactly is industrial music. And when you start going down its history around the mid-80s to late 80s, this is where the idea now of post-industrial comes from. Now, what's post-industrial? Post-industrial is really confusing to precisely say what it is, but this is where the idea now of industrial becomes so fluid, it starts branching into completely different styles of music and becoming their own thing. Examples of it can be drone, ambient, neo-folk, electronic body music, and of course, dark ambient music. Piecing this all together, when you look at the history of dark ambient music, it's a mixture between the creation of the synthesizer and electronic music meets the very unorthodox and experimentations of industrial meeting together. As we reach the 90s, this is where dark ambient music tends to get a bit more notoriety by the public. One of the big pioneers to dark ambient that helped give it a face would be Brian Williams, the mastermind behind the project LustMord. Now, Brian Williams has always had a strong foundation with industrial music and a lot of experimentation, as he's been active creating music since the year, I believe, 1980, and is still active to this day, releasing a few industrial albums under the LustMord name, and even assist SPK with some of their albums during the mid-80s. But it wouldn't be until the year 1990 with his album Heresy that we would get a real true first glimpse as to what dark ambient music is all about. As one can imagine, this is incredibly bleak, minimalistic, and very gloomy for a 1990 example of dark ambient music. But I think what makes LustMord just so essential for this style of music, even though technically there's been other artists that have dabbled with dark ambient in the past decades before, is LustMord is really the real true example of the modern understanding of what dark ambient music is when you're searching for it. Basically, in some sense, when you look at the influence that LustMord has on dark ambient music, he's equivalent to what Black Sabbath is to metal. Overall, when it comes to one of the essentials in dark ambient music, even though I'm stating stuff that's really obvious, if you want to get into it, you want to know what Ground Zero is all about dark ambient, what it was, what it is, and what it's basically going to continue to become, look no further than LustMord for an absolute essential. Another project that I believe was just as vital to the development of dark ambient music would be Raison D'être, a Swedish dark ambient project that was active from, I believe, 1991 and is still active to this day. Now, this project was signed to the label Cold Meat Industry, which is a label that's incredibly vital as well to the development of dark ambient music. And the reason for that is all of the early albums that Raison D'être did, it has that cold, isolated, and ultra dark take on ambience. And Roger Carmanek, the owner of Cold Meat Industry, who also is the head helm to the project known as Brighter Death Now, characterized the music that Raison D'être was doing, classifying it as dark ambient music, and this is where the term dark ambient stems from. While all the material by Raison D'être from the 1990s has all the components and pacing that one would come to expect to understand dark ambient music, which would definitely be classified as essential for the style, I do believe his outstanding best work would be an album that he did in the year 2000, The Empty Hollows Unfold, which still has all the pacing and sounds that one would come to expect with dark ambient music. However, whenever I listen to this album when I'm in the mood for it, it tends to be a bit more engaging. Yes, it's minimalistic. Yes, it's dark and ominous, which one would come to expect. But it's the subtlety of usage of classical music that's sparse in between some sections that you almost get it to be a bit more rhythmic and engaging sounding. That even though this album runs for quite a long time, I find the minutes to just fly by almost. It's like a really relaxing background music album that I would say as well, if you're trying to get into dark ambient music, this is a great place to start with. While LustMord and Raison D'être, in their own respected rights for what they did by themselves, is substantial for the development of dark ambient music that are huge, big essentials and influencers for it, I will state what's really the big contributor to really expanding dark ambient music, to giving it a scene, would be the label Cold Meat Industry. This label was ran by Roger Carmanek, a man I just talked about a minute ago for helping coin the term dark ambient when he was releasing Raison D'Etre's material under the label Cold Meat Industry. Now, it was active between the years of 1987 up until 2014 and reopened its doors in 2018. And while Cold Meat Industry wasn't exclusively just dark ambient music, as it had a wide array of different styles of experimental music such as noise, power electronics, drone, and all different other forms of ambience, it's still worth mentioning here because it at least gave dark ambient musicians and artists who wanted to experiment with this style of music a voice. I would strongly recommend everyone to check out any and everything that was put out under Cold Meat Industry if you're looking for more obscure and incredibly unorthodox approaches for electronic music that dives in within the realms of dark ambience. However, I would say one great place to start out with on the Cold Meat industry is none other than the project that Roger Carmanek was a part of, Brighter Death Now, the 1995 full-length album Necros Evangelicum. Now, to be upfront with you guys, this isn't necessarily a pure-blood dark ambient album, as it's a lot more abrasive and harsh and kind of sides more on power electronics and noise, and even to some people it's a predecessor to that of what death industrial is, which that's another topic for another day. However, I would state for people who want to be a bit more adventurous and showcase a bit more versatility into what dark ambient music can create, I would recommend this album. Yeah, it still sides more on noise, but the atmosphere and tone and overall vibe of it, there's so much dark ambience layered over it that it really becomes unforgiving and really nauseating. I would state for people who want to be a bit more adventurous as to showcase what dark ambience can create when it starts melding itself with other forms of electronic music, Brighter Death Now really showcases how mean, harsh, and unforgiving this style of music can become. As I stated a minute ago, there are a lot of releases that you should listen to for under Cold Meat industry if you want to discover more of the experimental side of dark ambient music. But one that I want to point out, which I'll get back to some later on in this video, but one that's always stood out to me is that there's a dark ambient album put out by this project called Aghast. This is the one full length they ever released and called it quits. And what's so interesting about it is it feels like a dark ambient album made for a black metal release, but never gets to the black metal portions. Almost as if it's a collective of all the interlude synthesizers that you would find in a black metal album, just all compiled onto one dark ambient album. And I feel like for people who enjoy black metal can really appreciate the music on this. Plus, it's also worth pointing out as well that Tanya Steen was a part of this project, and she was a woman that was heavily involved in the creation of a lot of black metal releases during the Norwegian black metal boom, as she did a lot of photography and collages for album artwork and bands during that time. And as well, she was even married to Fenriz for a short while. But getting back on track here in terms of what some of the essentials and must know for the development of dark ambient music, I would say the last real big one that must be known is the most recent one, really being the only one that formed in the 21st century. I believe some of his early works were like early 2000 releases, that being Atrium Carceri, all done by Simon Heath. And what's really important and interesting to point about Atrium Carceri is while it still maintains the very minimalistic, dark and gloomy sound that all of his predecessors did, what he adds to the table is it's a lot larger sounding, as if the production value, the sounds and textures you're hearing just feels more massive, climactic, and even cinematic to an extent. Every album that you'll hear from Atrium Carceri, it sounds like something that belongs in a movie soundtrack to a really gloomy, dystopian movie, or something to that of like a high-budget video game. So overall, I would state Atrium Carceri gives off more cinematic experiences with his approaches that I would state as well. If you're new to dark ambient music, definitely check this out. And it's worth mentioning as well, the man behind this project, after the kind of like closing of Cold Meat industry, as he was signed to the label from his early beginnings, as it was closing during the mid-2010s, he opened up his own label called Cryo Chamber, which in spirit is basically a continuation of Cold Meat industry, only puts a lot more attention and detail to that, to specifically dark ambient music, that again is another label worth checking out. With all this stated about the essentials for dark ambience and the brief little history that I gave it, one would wonder now, is this all this music offers? Just dark, ominous background noise is all this is. It's minimalistic, it's only meant to engulf you in this one-sided dark atmospheric approach, and that's it. And while yes, when you go down the rabbit hole of dark ambient artists, a lot of it does play around with the same ideas, only branching off with little minimalistic changes or ideas in terms of the themes they're playing around with isolation, existentialism, dread, nihilism, stuff like that, which is nothing new. But the reason why I wanted to make a video about this, and what I really find interesting about dark ambient music, is all the different ways people have experimented with it to meld it into something really creative while still maintaining the dark ambience that makes it unique. Take for example the second full-length album by Aphex Twin, Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. Now just like Volume 1, it's constructed in the same way of that EBM or electronic body music rhythm sections of how he does the percussions and synthesizers and all those wild electronics that he's known for, and combining it with ambience. That way on Selected Ambient Works Volume 1, it's a lot more of a chill out album. However, with Volume 2, I noticed that it tends to be a lot darker and even sharper to the ears, and I'd argue there's a wide range of usage of dark ambient music layered throughout this album, showcasing that there's a lot more experimentation to dark ambience than just it being, a backdrop for just darker and atmospheric music. Of course, you can say it stretches back even further to the late 80s. Dark ambience was being merged with forms of neoclassical darkwave. Take, for example, Controlled Bleeding with their album Music from the Scourging Ground, and Dead Can Dance with their album Within the Realm of a Dying Sun. Yes, both are neoclassical darkwave albums, but what really fleshes out the melancholic undertones here that really bleeds forth that dread ambience and atmosphere is when they utilize dark ambience in between sections. It doesn't stop there, however, for other genres adapting dark ambience. Believe it or not, there are some jazz bands that have done as well, nicknamed under the style of music known as dark jazz. A few examples that I can give you would be Painkiller with their 1994 album Execution Grounds, and Boren and Der Club of Gore with their album Sunset Mission, both giving off the ominous styles and ambience together with jazz music that makes for something creative, upbeat, and kind of disturbing all at the same time. And I'd even argue you can find it within the realms of pop music. It's very rare to come across, but I would say one example of it would be the debut full-length album by Fever Ray. While it's often characterized as a synth pop album that's very dark in terms of its production value and songwriting, there's no way you can deny the fact that the ambience and layering throughout the album resembles a lot of dark ambience. Thus, you get the lush sounds of pop music that's pretty accessible, but the atmosphere, the tone, the vibe, the pacing, the execution, it just oozes dark ambience from start to finish. But I would say the style of music that heavily adapted dark ambient more than any other style would be extreme metal, most particularly the subgenre known as, of course, black metal. I mean, look no further than Burzum. Literally, the first 4 Burzum albums, yes, they are black metal essentials, but make no mistake about it, and everyone knows this, and it's the selling point that a lot of people are amused with it, is that there are portions of ambience being broken up in between the black metal songs to where you get to the 3rd and 4th album, they play together side by side, all of which being core-lined with dark ambience. And I mean, come on, Philosophum, one song that always sticks out for a lot of people is the 20-minute long track that's just dark ambience being played from start to finish, which would open up the floodgates for so many other black metal bands and artists to play around with both styles of music. And I think a huge reason as to why that is even though in terms of structure they are the complete opposite, as ambient and dark ambient is slow and minimalistic, and black metal is a lot more vicious, eventful, aggressive, and faster, what they both share is that dark atmosphere that's very unwelcoming, that's harsh, that sounds really, anti-musical, so to say, and this is where they showcase similarities for each other. Examples of bands utilizing both together side by side would be Dark Space, Paysage d'Hiver. I know LustMord just did a straight up dark ambient album, I believe around like 2006 or 5, and they play around with both with other albums from time to time. Other Tongues, of course, that makes these very snuff filmed inducing sounding dark ambient black metal hybrid albums that is that of the stuff of Nightmares. But however, I do feel like the band that really did it to the fullest extent in terms of creativity that really doesn't get enough recognition would be An Axis of Perdition. I think really everything that they did is a perfect example of what black metal and dark ambient can do at its fullest extent. Honestly, literally everything that they did is so freaking good. It's nightmarish, but also very engaging. From their debut full-length album that is more aggressive as there's more black metal usage throughout it, but it's their second full-length album, the deleted scenes of the transitional hospital, that it's a straight up dark ambient album, and fucking hell, it is so terrifying but so entertaining at the same time. That is stuff that I cannot recommend enough if you're a fan of either black metal or you're looking for more creative dark ambient music. Then of course there's Dungeon Synth, which is basically dark ambient, only now you're taking the aesthetics of black metal, combining it together and making something that, even though is incredibly adjacent and very similar to dark ambient, its own thing. Of course you need to bring up Mortis, which is the humongous pioneer to that of Dungeon Synth, which I know I'm getting a little bit off topic here, as maybe one day I'll do a video for Dungeon Synth. But again, when it comes to all the different styles of music that would come from dark ambient, where it attaches itself with, it's worth mentioning. Really, again, it's kind of structured the same way, only there's a little bit more usage of synthesizers in the sense of classical music to make it a little bit more eventful. As again, it's taken the aesthetics of black metal, not the sound or instrumentation, but the aesthetics, and combining it with dark ambient. So Mortis obviously is a humongous pioneer to that. Of course, you need to mention, which is my personal favorite, Depressive Silence for Dungeon Synth, as it has a bit more classical music being involved with it. And I would also state what kind of reinvigorated the interest for people to listen to Dungeon Synth, as the most recently, of course, would be Old Tower. Now, with everything that I've stated thus far, I will admit I did kind of go a bit off topic here, because again, these are all other genres that have adapted dark ambient into their style. Now, one would wonder, well, what's happening right now with dark ambient music? Who's carrying the torch? Who's continuing on this sound other than just the old names that are continuing on to this day? Who are the newer ones? And to state that there are still dark ambient musicians and artists out there carrying the sound is an understatement. There's a lot, and I could just name a few that I search up, and that's really it without really much impact. However, I will state that there are dark ambient albums and artists out there that people tend to admire, yet they're not even realizing that they're playing around with a lot of influence embedded with dark ambience. Take, for example, The Caretaker. Everyone was raging about this album back when people were understanding the whole concept about it. Yes, there's a lot of drone, there's elements of musical concrete, classical in it, but from everything you will hear from it, even if you decide to listen to every part from beginning to end, dark ambience and drone is submerged throughout every portion you will hear. I would figure the fact that The Caretaker is a great example of modern day dark ambient music, or the Haxan Cloak, who released an album roughly a little over a decade ago, but I think it really captures the cinematic and really eerie essence that what makes dark ambient from when it started to present day something really special. Although it's kind of a bummer that the Haxan Cloak really isn't necessarily active anymore, as the individual behind this project has been making more soundtracks for movies, but still in vein of dark ambience. Take, for example, Midsummer is one of his creations that he did for soundtracks. Or lately, I've noticed a lot of people have been raving over the project known as Euboa, as I believe it just got signed to the Flenser earlier this year to release her new album that blends both forms of noise, even forms of death industrial together with dark ambience. That almost feels like, as weird as this is to say, a more personalized yet modern approach to Brighter Death Now, as it kind of shares some similar traits. And a last minute addition that I want to include that's more of a deep cut, but I just wanted to mention it in this video, is there was a Chinese project that was really short-lived that only did like, I think, 2 releases, but the debut full-length album by Enemite, Wu Yan, is so good. It's probably up there as like one of my all-time favorite, if that even counts, like dark ambient album. As I stated, it's a one-man Chinese dark ambient project that combines the forms and styles of dark ambience with like Chinese tribal music, but also having vocals of like black metal hisses throughout the album. And I don't know what it is, but I always get so heavily tranced whenever I listen to this album. And I think in terms of songwriting, creativity, and ideas, just really resonates with me out of everything I've talked about in this video. And I've never really seen anyone ever talk about this project. So I would strongly recommend to check it out if you're feeling adventurous. In conclusion with this video, there are a lot of dark ambient projects out there. Too many to name, too many to give credit to. And a lot of them carry the sounds of the most simplistic and straightforward approach with it. But I wanted to do a video all about dark ambient music, and I think the standout artist about it, because I really feel like this is a style of music that we're kind of unaware of. It's a part of so many things that we enjoy. So many dark, gloomy, isolated, nihilistic, or just harsh styles of music that we enjoy. Dark ambience just attaches itself with. And whether artists tend to make it noticeable or use it very subtly to the point that it goes over our head, it's a really important ingredient for making music more fleshed out in the darker sense, I feel like. That I know one YouTube video isn't going to give this style of music justice, but seriously, go down some rabbit holes and you'll start to notice just how prolific dark ambience is with just music that you enjoy in any sense. Again, especially if it's dark, cryptic music. It's a really important key factor here for stuff that we all enjoy. And I hope, at the very least, this video kind of sheds light, even though it's dark ambient music, to some artists and styles of music that you'll hopefully find more appreciation with. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, links provided to everything I talked about will be in the description below. Really curious to know what are some of your favorite dark ambient albums or other artists that you believe deserves a bit more recognition that I may have glossed over in this video. Always curious to know with your comments. And that'll do it for this video, guys. So like always, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.